Keiko Arai's hands trembled as American soldiers surrounded the cave entrance, their weapons drawn. She had been trained to fear this moment, told stories of what would happen to captured Japanese women. But when the soldiers led her and her fellow nurses into the makeshift medical camp, they didn't shackle her or shout commands. Instead, a weary-looking officer pointed to rows of wounded island civilians, women clutching bleeding children, elderly men with shattered limbs, and quietly said, "We need your help." Keiko's breath caught in her throat as medical supplies were placed in her hands. This wasn't what she'd been told would happen. This wasn't what she'd spent weeks fearing in the darkness of that cave. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The island of Saipan had become a living hell by the summer of 1945. Keiko Arai had arrived on the island 2 years earlier as a young Red Cross nurse, full of duty and determination to serve the wounded soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. She had been 23 years old then, fresh from her training in Tokyo, her crisp white uniform a symbol of healing and hope. She had imagined herself working in clean hospital wards, bringing comfort to brave men who had sacrificed for their country. The reality had been nothing like her imagination. From the moment she stepped off the transport ship, Keiko had been thrust into chaos. The hospital facilities were crude at best, often nothing more than tents or repurposed buildings with inadequate supplies. The wounded came in waves, their injuries horrific and beyond anything her training had prepared her for. She learned to work with almost nothing, to improvise, to make impossible decisions about who could be saved and who could not. The other nurses, 6 women who became her closest companions, shared her struggles and her silent tears when they lost patients they'd fought desperately to save. Fumiko Tanaka was the eldest of their group, a stern woman of 35 who had served as a nurse since the beginning of the war. Her hands were steady even when the bombs fell close enough to shake the ground beneath their feet, and she never showed fear in front of the patients. Yumi Nakamura was gentle and soft-spoken, barely 20 years old, with a gift for comforting dying soldiers in their final moments. Haruka Watanabe had been a schoolteacher before the war and brought an unexpected cheerfulness to even the darkest days, singing quietly as she worked. Ayako Suzuki was practical and efficient, able to organize chaos into order with remarkable speed. Reiko Yamamoto was the quietest of them all, moving like a ghost through the wards, her face rarely showing any emotion even when the situation was dire. Together, they had formed a bond stronger than family, surviving on determination and the belief that their work mattered. By the spring of 1945, it had become clear that the Americans were coming. The sound of distant naval bombardment had become a constant companion, a low rumble that made the windows rattle and sent dust falling from the ceiling beams. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Keiko found herself reusing bandages that should have been burned, rationing morphine so strictly that men screamed in agony, boiling water over and over because there was no way to ensure it was truly clean. The soldiers who could still walk began to speak in hushed whispers about what would happen when the Americans landed, about orders they'd received, about the honor of dying rather than surrendering. Keiko tried not to listen to those whispers. She focused on her work, on the man in front of her who needed his wound cleaned, on the soldier whose fever she was trying to break with cold compresses made from their dwindling water supply. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent, and then one morning the bombardment intensified to a level that made previous attacks seem like gentle rain compared to a typhoon. The American invasion began on June 15th, and the world exploded. Keiko had thought she understood what war meant, but nothing had prepared her for the assault on Saipan. The naval guns fired with such intensity that the very air seemed to vibrate, and when the shells landed, they tore the earth apart. Buildings that had stood for decades vanished in clouds of smoke and debris. The hospital where they worked took a direct hit on the second day, the wing where they stored what little medical supplies remained simply ceasing to exist in a thunderous blast that left Keiko's ears ringing for hours afterward. The Japanese forces fought with desperate ferocity, but they were overwhelmed. Day by day, the American forces pushed further inland, and the Japanese defenders fell back, taking their wounded with them when possible, leaving them behind when necessary. Keiko and the other nurses moved with the retreating soldiers, carrying what supplies they could, setting up temporary aid stations in caves and hollows, working by candlelight and sometimes by no light at all. The civilian population of Saipan, caught between the two armies, suffered terribly. Keiko saw entire families torn apart by shell fire, children wandering alone and crying for parents who would never answer, elderly people too weak to flee the fighting. The Japanese military command had told the civilians that the Americans were monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities, and many believed these warnings absolutely. Keiko watched as families chose to flee into the wilderness rather than risk capture, heading for the island's rugged interior with little food and no shelter. By early July, the situation had become impossible. The Japanese forces had been pushed into a small pocket in the northern part of the island, their backs to the sea, their ammunition nearly exhausted. Keiko and her fellow nurses had retreated with a group of soldiers and civilians to a complex of caves in the limestone cliffs. There were perhaps 200 people crammed into the darkness, most of them civilians, families with young children and elderly grandparents. The soldiers who remained were mostly wounded, men who could barely stand, let alone fight. They had almost no food. Their water came from a trickle that seeped through the cave walls, and their medical supplies consisted of a few dirty bandages and a single vial of morphine that Fumiko kept hidden in her pocket. In the cave, time became strange and fluid. Keiko couldn't tell if hours or days were passing in the complete darkness of the deeper chambers. They rationed their candles and matches so strictly that most of the time they sat in utter blackness, listening to the sounds of breathing and quiet weeping, the occasional moan of someone in pain. Children cried for food their parents couldn't provide. Old men coughed with deep rattling sounds that spoke of illness taking hold. The air grew thick and foul, heavy with the smell of too many unwashed bodies pressed together in an enclosed space. Keiko tried to help where she could, but what could she do without supplies, without light, without even clean water? She held the hand of a young mother whose infant had died during the night, sitting with her in the darkness as the woman's silent tears fell. She felt the forehead of an old man who burned with fever, knowing there was nothing she could give him for comfort except her presence. She listened as soldiers whispered about making a final charge, about dying with honor, about taking their own lives rather than facing capture. The propaganda they'd all been fed for years echoed in Keiko's mind during those dark hours. The Americans were brutal, they'd been told. Enemy soldiers would torture prisoners, would violate women, would show no mercy to anyone they captured. The messages had been reinforced again and again through official channels, through newspapers and radio broadcasts, through the stories told by officers who claimed to have witnessed American atrocities. Keiko had heard these warnings so many times that they had become part of her understanding of the world and accepted truth that she'd never questioned. She remembered a lecture from her training days, a stern-faced officer telling the class of young nurses what to expect if they were ever captured by the enemy. He had described scenarios that made several of the trainees faint, that sent others running from the room to be sick. Keiko had forced herself to listen, to prepare mentally for the possibility, though every word had filled her with cold dread. The officer had concluded by saying that death was preferable to capture, that true service to the emperor meant choosing honor over survival. Now, huddled in the darkness of the cave with dozens of terrified civilians, those words took on a horrible weight. She could hear mothers whispering to their children, preparing them for what might come. She could hear soldiers checking their weapons, counting their last few bullets. She could feel the suffocating sense of hopelessness that pervaded the cave like the stale air itself. Fumiko gathered the nurses together one night, or what they assumed was night since they could no longer see the sky. Her voice was barely a whisper in the darkness. "We need to decide what we'll do when they come," she said quietly. "The Americans will find us eventually. We need to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" Yumi asked, her voice trembling. Keiko could hear the fear in the young woman's tone, could imagine her wide eyes though she couldn't see them in the blackness. "For whatever happens," Fumiko replied. "We've all heard what they do to captured nurses. We need to decide if we're going to surrender or if we're going to choose another path." Keiko's stomach turned at the implication. She had seen soldiers take their own lives rather than face capture, had seen families make the same terrible choice. The thought of doing that herself, of making that final decision, filled her with a fear so profound it made her hands shake. But the alternative, based on everything they'd been told, seemed even worse. Maybe the stories aren't true, Haruka suggested quietly. Maybe the Americans aren't as bad as we've been told. You want to risk finding out? Reiko's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and bitter. You want to be the one to test whether the propaganda was accurate? They sat in silence for a long time after that, each woman alone with her thoughts and fears. Keiko tried to imagine what capture would mean, tried to prepare herself mentally for the possibilities, but her mind kept circling back to the same paralyzing terror. She was 25 years old, and the life she'd imagined for herself, marriage and children and a home filled with laughter, seemed impossibly distant now, something that belonged to another person in another lifetime. The children in the cave grew quieter as the days passed, their crying reduced to weak whimpers as hunger and thirst took their toll. Keiko used her small water ration to wet the lips of a toddler who had stopped responding to his mother's pleas, and she felt rage and grief wash over her at the waste of it all, at the senseless suffering of innocents who had done nothing to deserve this fate. What kind of war targeted children? What kind of world allowed this to happen? On what Keiko later learned was July 9th, the soldiers made their decision. A young lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, gathered the able-bodied men and told them they would make a final assault at dawn. It would be a suicide charge, he said calmly, an attack designed not to win but to die with honor. He looked at the civilians and the nurses and told them they should follow suit, that capture was worse than death, that the emperor would honor their sacrifice. Keiko watched as families began to say their goodbyes, as mothers held their children close and fathers spoke in low, urgent tones to their wives. She saw the soldiers checking their rifles, fixing their bayonets, preparing themselves for one last act of defiance. The weight of despair in that cave was crushing, a palpable thing that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to imagine that tomorrow would come or that it mattered if it did. But dawn brought something unexpected. Before the soldiers could launch their attack, voices called out from the cave entrance in Japanese, heavily accented but clear enough to understand. You are surrounded. There is no escape. But you will not be harmed if you surrender. We have food and water and medicine. Please, come out peacefully. The people in the cave looked at each other in the dim light that filtered in from outside, hope and fear battling on their faces. Was this a trick? Were the Americans lying to lure them out? The lieutenant gripped his rifle tighter and shook his head firmly. It's a trap, he hissed. They want us to come out so they can slaughter us more easily. But a woman holding a limp child stood up, her voice cracking as she spoke. My daughter is dying. She needs water and medicine. I don't care what happens to me. I won't watch her die when there might be help available. Before anyone could stop her, she began walking toward the entrance, her daughter in her arms. Keiko held her breath, waiting for the sound of gunfire, for the woman's scream. Instead, she heard gentle voices, American voices speaking in halting Japanese, offering water. She heard the woman begin to cry, not in pain but in relief. And then more civilians began to move toward the entrance, slowly at first. Then, in a steady stream, as hope overcame fear. The lieutenant tried to stop them, shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the movement of people desperate for water, for food, for an end to the suffocating darkness of the cave. Keiko and the other nurses looked at each other, uncertain what to do. They were bound by duty to follow military authority, but they were also bound by their calling to care for those in need, and the civilians clearly needed help. Fumiko made the decision for them. We go out, she said firmly. If they're going to kill us, we can't stop them anyway. But maybe there's a chance we can help these people. Maybe that's what matters now. She stood up, smoothing her filthy, tattered uniform, and walked toward the light. The others followed. Keiko's legs trembled as she moved through the cave, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every step felt like it might be her last, and she had to force herself to keep moving forward instead of fleeing back into the darkness. The sunlight at the entrance was blinding after so many days in the cave, and she raised her hand to shield her eyes, stumbling slightly as her vision adjusted. American soldiers surrounded the cave entrance, dozens of them with weapons ready. But they weren't firing, they weren't shouting or threatening. Instead, they were handing out canteens of water to the civilians who emerged, offering ration bars to hungry children, helping elderly people who could barely walk. Keiko blinked in confusion, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd been told to expect. An officer approached her, a man with tired eyes and dust-covered uniform who looked like he hadn't slept in days. He spoke to her in English, and a Japanese-American soldier beside him translated. "Are you nurses?" he asked, gesturing to her uniform, to the Red Cross armband she still wore despite its dirt and tears. Keiko nodded mutely. Unable to form words, her throat was dry from lack of water, her mind reeling from the sudden change in circumstances. She was a prisoner now, captured by the enemy, and any moment the treatment would shift, the kindness would reveal itself as a cruel deception before the real horrors began. But the officer just nodded and said something to the translator, who turned to Keiko and the others. "The officer says they need medical help. There are many wounded civilians who need care. He's asking if you're willing to work." Keiko stared at the translator in disbelief. Work? They wanted her to work, to use her nursing skills? This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate trap. She glanced at Fumiko, who looked equally stunned, her mouth slightly open in shock. "Tell him we'll help," Fumiko said slowly, her voice hoarse. "Tell him we're nurses. We help the wounded. That's what we do." The translator spoke to the officer, who nodded and gestured for them to follow. They were led through the chaotic scene of surrender, past groups of frightened civilians being given water and food, past Japanese soldiers sitting with their hands on their heads under guard, past the organized confusion of an army dealing with hundreds of prisoners all at once. Keiko kept expecting someone to grab her, to shout at her, to drag her away for interrogation or worse, but the Americans simply led them through the crowd with businesslike efficiency. They arrived at a makeshift medical area set up under canvas tarps strung between trees, and there, laid out on blankets and stretchers, were dozens of wounded people. These weren't soldiers, Keiko realized with a start. These were islanders, native Saipanese and Chamorro people who had been caught in the fighting. Women with shrapnel wounds, children with broken bones, elderly men with infected injuries that had gone untreated for days or weeks. The wounded looked at the Japanese nurses with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. An American medic approached, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. He held out boxes of medical supplies, fresh bandages, bottles of antiseptic, packages of sulfa powder, vials of morphine. Real medical supplies, more than Keiko had seen in months. The medic spoke in English, gesturing to the wounded, and the translator conveyed his message. "Please help them. We don't have enough personnel to treat everyone. We need your medical skills." Keiko took the supplies with shaking hands, staring down at the clean white bandages, the glass bottles with typed labels, the abundance of materials she'd dreamed about during those desperate months of rationing and improvisation. She looked at her fellow nurses, saw her own shock and confusion reflected on their faces. This wasn't torture. This wasn't brutality. This was exactly what they'd been trained to do, what they'd dedicated their lives to doing. Fumiko was the first to move, kneeling beside an old woman with a deep gash on her leg. She opened a package of bandages and began to clean the wound with steady, practiced movements. Yumi followed, moving to a child with a splinted arm that needed proper attention. Haruka, Ayako, and Reiko spread out among the wounded, each finding someone who needed care. Keiko stood frozen for a moment longer, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Then she saw a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, lying on a blanket with tears streaming down her face. The girl's shoulder was wrapped in a crude, blood-stained bandage, and her eyes were wide with pain and fear. Keiko moved without thinking, her training overriding her confusion and terror. She knelt beside the girl and spoke softly in Japanese, even though the child might not understand. "I'm going to help you," she said gently. "I'm a nurse. Let me see your wound." The girl flinched back at first, and her mother, sitting beside her, pulled the child closer, protectively. But then Keiko carefully unwrapped the dirty bandage, revealing a shrapnel wound that had become infected. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her movements gentle and careful, applying sulfa powder to fight the infection, wrapping it with clean white bandages. As she worked, The girl's crying quieted, and her mother watched with cautious gratitude. An American medic worked beside Keiko, treating a young boy with burns on his hands. The medic glanced at her work and nodded approvingly, offering a small smile. Keiko found herself nodding back, a strange and surreal moment of professional respect passing between them. Here she was, a captured Japanese nurse, working side by side with the enemy, both of them focused on the same goal of healing the wounded. As the afternoon wore on, Keiko lost herself in the work. It was a relief to do something useful, to use her skills, to see wounds properly cleaned and bandaged instead of having to choose which patients to neglect due to lack of supplies. The American medics treated her and the other Japanese nurses with professional courtesy, asking questions when they needed clarification, offering suggestions when they saw a better approach, working together like colleagues rather than captors and prisoners. The wounded civilians responded to the care with gratitude that transcended language barriers. Mothers bowed their heads in thanks. Old men squeezed her hand gently. Children who had been crying in pain grew quiet as their hurts were tended. Keiko felt tears sliding down her face as she worked, an overwhelming mixture of relief and confusion and grief for all the propaganda she'd believed, for all the time she'd spent in terror of this moment that had turned out to be nothing like what she'd expected. As evening approached, an American officer came through the medical area with a translator, checking on the patients and speaking to the medical personnel. When he reached Keiko, he stopped and looked at her worn uniform, at the careful bandage work on the patient beside her. "You're doing good work," he said through the translator. "Thank you for helping these people. They've suffered enough." Keiko couldn't speak. She just nodded, unable to articulate the storm of emotions inside her. The officer moved on, and Fumiko approached, her own eyes red from crying. "This isn't what they told us would happen," Fumiko whispered. "Nothing we were told was true." "No," Keiko agreed quietly. "It wasn't." That night, the Japanese nurses were taken to a holding area where other prisoners were kept, but it was nothing like the dungeons or torture chambers they'd imagined. They were given food, real food, canned rations that tasted better than anything Keiko had eaten in months. They were given water, as much as they wanted to drink. They were shown to tents where they could sleep on cots with blankets. Guards watched them, but the guards weren't cruel or menacing. They just looked tired, ready for the war to end. Keiko lay on her cot that night, staring up at the canvas ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She thought about all the propaganda she'd been fed, all the warnings and threats and horror stories. She thought about the young lieutenant in the cave who had been ready to die rather than surrender, who had urged others to do the same. She thought about the families who had fled into the wilderness rather than face capture, choosing starvation over surrender because they believed the Americans would be worse. How many people had died believing those lies? How many soldiers had thrown their lives away in senseless charges because they thought death was better than capture? How many civilians had taken their children's lives and then their own, terrified of horrors that existed only in propaganda? The weight of that realization was crushing, and Keiko cried silently into her thin pillow, mourning all the waste and all the unnecessary death. But she also thought about the wounded child whose shoulder she'd treated, about the girl's tears stopping as the pain was eased, about the mother's grateful eyes. She thought about the American medic who had worked beside her, treating the wounded with the same care she gave, focused only on healing. She thought about the officer who had thanked her for helping, as if her skills still mattered, as if she was still a nurse and not just a prisoner. In the morning, they were taken back to the medical area. More wounded civilians had been brought in during the night, and there was work to be done. Keiko and the other nurses fell into a routine over the following days, treating patients under the supervision of American medical personnel, learning to work with different methods and different supplies, but always with the same goal of easing suffering and promoting healing. The American medics began to teach them English medical terms, pointing to instruments and supplies and pronouncing the words slowly. Keiko found herself learning phrases like blood pressure and infection and sutures, her pronunciation awkward at first, but improving with practice. The medics in turn learned some Japanese from the nurses, creating a hybrid vocabulary that allowed them to communicate more effectively about patient care. One afternoon, a week after their capture, Keiko was cleaning a wound on an elderly man's arm when one of the American medics, a corporal named Henderson, sat down beside her to work on the man's other injuries. Henderson was young, probably no more than 22, with freckles across his nose and a gentle manner with patients. He had been consistently kind to the Japanese nurses, never treating them with suspicion or hostility. As they worked together in companionable silence, Henderson suddenly spoke in halting Japanese. "My sister is a nurse," he said carefully, clearly having practiced the phrase, "in California. I think you would like her. She works very hard, like you." Keiko looked at him in surprise, this enemy soldier who was trying to connect with her in her own language, who was telling her about his family. "I have a sister too," she replied in equally halting English, "in Kyoto." "I hope she is safe," Henderson nodded seriously. "The war will end soon," he said, switching back to English with the translator helping. "Then everyone can go home. Then sisters don't have to worry anymore." It was such a simple sentiment, but it hit Keiko with unexpected force. This American soldier, who she'd been taught to see as a monster, missed his sister and hoped for peace just like she did. He had a family waiting for him, people who worried about him, dreams of a life after the war. He was just a person, doing a difficult job in terrible circumstances, trying to help wounded civilians because it was the right thing to do. "Yes," Keiko said softly. "Then we can go home." As the days turned into weeks, Keiko began to see more clearly how thoroughly she'd been deceived by her own government's propaganda. The American soldiers weren't the demons she'd been told to expect. They were tired young men who wanted to go home, who showed kindness to prisoners and civilians, who shared their rations with hungry children even when their own supplies were limited. They weren't perfect, certainly. She saw guards who were harsh, officers who were impatient, soldiers who viewed the Japanese with suspicion and anger. But they weren't the monsters of propaganda. They were human beings with all the complexity that implied. The wounded civilians in the medical area began to relax around the Japanese nurses as they realized they would receive genuine care. Mothers brought their sick children willingly, trusting that Keiko and the others would help. Elderly people sought treatment for ailments they'd been suffering with for months. The native Saipanese, who had been caught between two armies and brutalized by both, slowly began to heal under the care of medical personnel who saw them as patients rather than obstacles or collateral damage. Keiko formed a particular bond with one patient, a woman named Rosa, who was part Chamorro and spoke some Japanese from before the war. Rosa's leg had been badly injured when her home collapsed during a bombardment, and she required daily wound care to prevent infection. As Keiko changed her bandages each day, the women talked, and Rosa shared what life had been like for the civilians of Saipan. "We knew the Japanese and Americans would fight here," Rosa said one afternoon as Keiko cleaned her wound. "We hoped we could just stay out of the way, but there was no safe place. The Japanese soldiers took our food, our homes. They said we should be grateful to die for the emperor. But he's not our emperor. We just wanted to live in peace." Keiko listened, feeling shame burn in her chest. She had been so focused on her duty to Japanese soldiers that she had given little thought to what the war meant for the people who actually lived on these islands. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry for what you suffered." Rosa reached out and patted Keiko's hand gently. "You're a healer," she said simply. "You help people. That's good work no matter what uniform you wear." Those words stayed with Keiko, giving her a framework to understand her new reality. She was still a nurse, still a healer. That core identity hadn't changed even though everything else had. The uniform she wore was filthy and torn. The army she'd served had been defeated. The world she'd known had collapsed, but her skills and her calling remained. She could still ease pain, still clean wounds, still offer comfort to the suffering. That mattered, perhaps more than anything else. The other nurses were going through similar transformations. Yumi, the youngest, seemed to blossom under the new circumstances, her natural gentleness finding full expression now that she had adequate supplies and support. She spent hours with the children, singing to them softly as she treated their injuries, making them smile despite their pain. Haruka organized the medical area with impressive efficiency, ensuring supplies were properly stored and inventory was maintained. Ayako began teaching some of the native women basic first aid, using gestures and the translator to convey information about cleaning wounds and recognizing infection. Reiko remained quiet and reserved, but Keiko noticed her spending extra time with the most severely wounded, sitting with them even when there was no medical care to give, just offering the comfort of presence. Fumiko continued to lead the group with steady authority, but even she had softened. One evening, as they prepared for bed in their tent, she gathered the nurses together. "I thought we would die in that cave," she said quietly. "I thought the stories were true, and death was the only honorable choice. I was wrong, and I'm grateful I was wrong. We have a chance to continue our work, to help people who need us. That's a gift I didn't expect to receive." "What will happen to us?" Yumi asked, voicing the question they'd all been avoiding. "When the war ends, where will we go?" Fumiko shook her head. "I don't know. We're prisoners, and we'll remain prisoners until someone decides otherwise, but we're alive, and we can still be useful. For now, that's enough." Life in the prisoner camp settled into a routine. Each morning, the nurses would be escorted to the medical area where they would work until evening, treating wounded civilians and occasionally Japanese prisoners who had been injured during capture or who fell ill in the camp. The American medical personnel continued to treat them with professional courtesy, and Keiko began to appreciate the different approaches to medicine they demonstrated. The Americans had supplies and resources that allowed for more aggressive treatment, and they were willing to try new methods that might not always work, but sometimes produced remarkable results. One day, an American doctor, Captain Morrison, asked Keiko to assist with a surgical procedure on a young boy who had shrapnel embedded near his spine. The surgery was delicate and dangerous, requiring steady hands and careful precision. Keiko had never assisted with such a complex operation, but Captain Morrison walked her through each step, explaining what he was doing and why, trusting her to hand him instruments and to monitor the patient's vital signs. The surgery took 3 hours, and when it was finally complete, the boy's prognosis had improved dramatically. Captain Morrison pulled off his gloves and smiled at Keiko. "Excellent work, nurse," he said through the translator. "You have a steady hand and good instincts. Thank you for your assistance." Keiko felt a surge of pride at the praise, a reminder that her skills were valued, that she could still make a difference. She bowed slightly, the gesture automatic, and said in careful English, "Thank you for teaching me." Captain Morrison nodded and patted her shoulder gently before moving on to check on other patients. That small gesture of respect and acknowledgement meant more to Keiko than she could easily express. She was not just a prisoner to be guarded and contained. She was a medical professional whose skills were recognized and utilized. That recognition restored something essential to her sense of self. As July turned to August, news filtered through the camp about the progress of the war. The Americans were advancing across the Pacific, taking island after island. The Japanese military was being pushed back on all fronts, their navy largely destroyed, their air force decimated. The guards and medics talked about it openly, not bothering to hide the information from the prisoners because the outcome was no longer in doubt. Keiko listened to these reports with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her, the part that had been trained to serve the emperor and believe in the righteousness of Japan's cause, felt grief at each defeat. But another part of her, the part that had spent the last weeks caring for wounded civilians and seeing the human cost of the war, felt a growing hope that perhaps the fighting would end soon, that the killing would stop, that peace might be possible. On August 6th, something happened that the guards wouldn't talk about in detail, but the camp buzzed with rumors and tension. The American personnel seemed shocked and disturbed by something, and the translator mentioned something about a new type of bomb, a single weapon that had destroyed an entire city. Keiko couldn't comprehend what that meant. How could one bomb destroy a whole city? It seemed impossible, like something from a nightmare rather than reality. 3 days later, the same thing happened again. Another city, another impossible bomb. And the next day, the camp erupted with news that the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. The American guards seemed to think these events meant the end was coming, that Japan would have to surrender now, that the war would finally be over. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast over the radio, something unprecedented in Japanese history. Keiko and the other Japanese prisoners were allowed to listen, crowded around a radio set up in the camp. The emperor's voice was high and thin, using formal court language that was difficult to understand, but the message was clear enough. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. Keiko sat in stunned silence as the broadcast ended. It was over. Years of fighting, years of death and destruction and suffering, and now it was simply over. She didn't know what to feel. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for all those who had died for a cause that had now been abandoned. Fear about what would happen to Japan under occupation. Uncertainty about her own future. All these emotions swirled together until she couldn't separate them, until she felt numb and overwhelmed all at once. The American guards were celebrating, passing around bottles and shaking hands, their faces showing the profound relief of men who had survived a terrible ordeal and would now be going home. The Japanese prisoners sat quietly, processing what they had heard, trying to understand what it meant for them. Some wept openly, others stared into space with blank expressions, still others seemed almost relieved that the uncertainty was over, even if the outcome was defeat. Fumiko gathered the nurses together that evening. "The war is over," she said simply. "We survived. Many didn't, but we did. Now we have to figure out what comes next." "Will we be sent home?" Haruka asked. "Will they let us go back to Japan?" "Eventually, I assume," Fumiko replied. "But it might take time. Japan is in ruins from what we've heard. Transportation will be complicated. For now, we wait and continue working. At least we can be useful while we wait." The weeks after the surrender were strange and uncertain. The guards were less vigilant, the camp routine more relaxed. Japanese prisoners were given more freedom to move around within the compound, to organize their own activities and structures. The wounded civilians in the medical area continued to need care, and Keiko and the other nurses continued to provide it, falling back on the familiarity of their work when everything else felt uncertain. Captain Morrison called Keiko to his office one afternoon in early September. She went nervously, unsure what to expect, but the captain simply wanted to thank her for her work. "The wounded civilians have received excellent care thanks to you and your colleagues," he said through the translator. "I wanted you to know that I've submitted a report commending your medical work. When the time comes for repatriation, I hope this documentation will help you continue your nursing career in Japan." Keiko was stunned by this gesture. Not only had the captain recognized their work, he had documented it officially, thinking ahead to their future and how this experience might benefit them. She bowed deeply, tears springing to her eyes. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say in English. "Thank you for letting us help, for giving us purpose." Captain Morrison smiled, looking tired but kind. "You're good nurses," he said simply. "The wounded needed you, regardless of what uniform you wear or what flag you salute. Medicine should be above politics, above war. We're all just trying to save lives." Those words resonated deeply with Keiko. Medicine above politics, healing above hate, humanity above nationality. It was a philosophy she wished she'd been taught from the beginning, a perspective that might have prevented so much suffering if more people had embraced it. She left the captain's office with a renewed sense of purpose and a fragile hope for the future. As September progressed, preparations began for the eventual repatriation of Japanese prisoners. It would be a massive undertaking, moving thousands of people back to a defeated and devastated homeland. But the Americans were determined to do it in an orderly and humane fashion. Lists were compiled, health checks were conducted, transportation was arranged. The process would take months, everyone was told. They needed to be patient. In the meantime, life in the camp continued. Keiko found herself thinking often about what she would find when she returned to Japan. Her family lived in Yokohama, which she'd heard had been heavily bombed. Were her parents still alive? Her two younger brothers had been conscripted into the military. Where were they now? Her sister, who was studying to be a teacher, had she survived? The uncertainty was agonizing, but there was nothing she could do except wait and hope. The medical work continued to provide purpose and distraction. The number of wounded civilians gradually decreased as people healed and were discharged. But there were always new cases. People who had been hiding in the jungle and were only now coming out, individuals with chronic conditions that had gone untreated during the chaos of war. Keiko treated them all with the same care and attention she'd given from the beginning, finding satisfaction in the simple act of healing. One afternoon, in late September, a young Chamorro woman was brought to the medical area. She was pregnant and in premature labor, frightened and in pain. The American medics had limited experience with obstetrics, and they turned to the Japanese nurses for help. Fumiko took charge immediately, her years of experience making her the natural choice to manage the delivery. She enlisted Keiko and Yumi to assist, sending the others to prepare supplies and boil water. The delivery was difficult and dangerous, the baby was coming too early, and the mother was weakened by months of inadequate nutrition. Fumiko worked with steady competence, guiding the mother through contractions, monitoring the baby's progress, making decisions quickly when complications arose. Keiko followed her instructions precisely, providing support and assistance, while Yumi held the mother's hand and spoke soothing words, even though the woman probably couldn't understand Japanese. After hours of intense labor, a tiny baby girl was born, small and fragile, but alive and crying. Fumiko carefully cleaned and wrapped the infant, checking her reflexes and breathing before handing her to the exhausted mother. The woman looked at her daughter with such profound love and relief that Keiko felt her own eyes fill with tears. Here, in the midst of all the death and destruction the war had brought, was new life, a symbol of hope and continuity. The American medics who had been standing by applauded softly, and Captain Morrison shook Fumiko's hand. "Outstanding work," he said warmly. "That baby is alive because of your skill and experience. Both mother and child are fortunate you were here." Fumiko accepted the praise with quiet dignity, but Keiko saw the satisfaction in her eyes. They had saved 2 lives today, had brought new hope into a world that desperately needed it. This was why they had become nurses, for moments like this, for the privilege of helping others in their most vulnerable moments. As Keiko cleaned up after the delivery, washing instruments and organizing supplies, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day when they'd emerged from the cave expecting death or torture. She had been given a gift she hadn't expected, the opportunity to continue being a nurse, to continue helping others, to continue finding meaning and purpose in her work. The circumstances were not what she would have chosen, being a prisoner in an enemy camp, but within those constraints she had found a way to remain true to her calling. October brought cooler weather and more definitive news about repatriation. The Japanese nurses were told they would likely be sent home in November or December, once transportation could be arranged and once the situation in Japan was more stable. They would be returned to Japanese ports under American supervision, and from there they would need to find their own way home, assuming they had homes to return to. The prospect of leaving brought mixed emotions. Keiko wanted to go home, desperately wanted to find her family and discover what had survived of her old life. But she had also grown accustomed to the routine of the camp, to the work in the medical area, to the relationships she'd formed with both fellow prisoners and American medical personnel. Leaving meant venturing into an unknown future, facing a defeated and occupied homeland, dealing with whatever devastation awaited. She also felt a strange reluctance to leave the wounded civilians she'd been caring for. Rosa, the Chamorro woman whose leg she'd treated for months, had become almost a friend. They had shared so many conversations, had found common ground despite their different backgrounds and the barriers of language. Rosa's leg had healed well under Keiko's care, and she would soon be discharged to return to what remained of her village. The thought of never seeing her again, of never knowing how her life turned out, saddened Keiko more than she expected. On one of their last days together, Rosa took Keiko's hand and spoke earnestly. "You saved my leg," she said in her careful Japanese. "Maybe saved my life. I won't forget you, Nurse Keiko. I'll tell my children and grandchildren about the Japanese nurse who was kind to me, who cared for me when I needed help. I'll tell them that even in war, there are good people on both sides." Keiko squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I'll remember you too," she finally managed. "You taught me to see beyond uniforms and flags, to remember that we're all just people trying to survive. Thank you for that gift." The young mother whose baby Fumiko had delivered named her daughter Hope, the English word chosen deliberately to represent what the child meant to her family. She brought the baby to the medical area regularly for checkups, and each time she insisted on showing the infant to all the Japanese nurses, thanking them again for saving both their lives. The baby thrived under careful monitoring, gaining weight and strength, a small miracle of resilience. As November arrived, the final preparations for repatriation intensified. The Japanese prisoners were organized into groups based on their home regions, medical conditions, and other factors. Keiko and her fellow nurses were placed in a group scheduled to leave in mid-December, traveling by ship to Yokohama. They were given new clothes to replace their worn uniforms, provided with basic supplies for the journey, and briefed on what to expect upon arrival in Japan. The briefings painted a grim picture. Japan had been devastated by the bombing campaign, particularly the firebombing of major cities. Millions were homeless, food was scarce, infrastructure was destroyed. The American occupation was ongoing, with General MacArthur overseeing the transformation of Japanese society. Emperor Hirohito had remained on the throne, but had renounced his divinity, shocking a population that had been taught to worship him as a living god. It was a new Japan they would be returning to, fundamentally changed from the country they had left. On her last day working in the medical area, Keiko made rounds one final time, checking on patients she'd been treating, saying quiet goodbyes to those who were well enough to understand. The American medics threw a small farewell gathering, sharing candy and cigarettes, expressing genuine regret that the Japanese nurses were leaving. Henderson, the young corporal who had told her about his sister, gave Keiko a small photograph of himself in uniform. "So, you remember that Americans can be good people," he said through the translator, smiling shyly. "So you remember that we were colleagues, not just enemies." Keiko accepted the photograph carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "I could never forget," she said softly. "You and the others showed me the truth when my own government had only shown me lies. You treated me with respect and kindness when I expected cruelty. That's a debt I can never repay." Captain Morrison gave each of the nurses a written reference, official documents attesting to their medical skills and commendable work during their imprisonment. "These may help you find work when you return home," he explained. "Japan will need nurses desperately as it rebuilds. I hope these references will open doors for you." Fumiko accepted the documents for all of them, bowing deeply. "You have been more than fair to us, Captain," she said formally. "You allowed us to continue our calling, to help those in need. Many commanders would not have done so. We are grateful." The captain nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "You earned the right to help through your skill and dedication," he replied. "I simply recognized good nurses when I saw them. I hope your futures are bright and that Japan finds peace and prosperity." On December 10th, Keiko and the other nurses were loaded onto trucks along with hundreds of other Japanese prisoners and driven to the port. The ship that would take them home was a massive transport vessel, utilitarian and crowded but seaworthy. The prisoners were assigned to holds below deck, cramped spaces with minimal amenities, but after months in the prisoner camp, it seemed almost luxurious to have a defined space and the promise of movement toward home. As the ship pulled away from Saipan, Keiko stood on deck watching the island recede into the distance. So much had happened on that small piece of land, so many lives lost, so many lessons learned. She thought about the terrified woman she'd been emerging from that cave, certain she faced torture and death. She thought about the gradual realization that everything she'd been told was a lie, that the enemy was human, that healing transcended nationality. She thought about the wounded civilians she'd cared for, the American medics she'd worked alongside, the future that was now uncertain but at least possible. Yumi came to stand beside her at the rail, looking equally pensive. "Are you scared?" the younger nurse asked quietly. "About going home, I mean, about what we'll find?" "Yes," Keiko admitted, terrified, but also hopeful. "We survived, Yumi. Against all odds, we survived. And we helped people. We made a difference. Whatever we find in Japan, we'll face it together. All of us. We're strong enough to rebuild our lives because we've already survived the impossible." The voyage took 2 weeks, the ship stopping at several islands to pick up more Japanese prisoners before finally heading to Japan proper. The conditions below deck were difficult, cramped and stuffy with inadequate sanitation, but Keiko and the other nurses used their medical skills to help fellow prisoners who fell ill during the journey. There were cases of seasickness, of infections that had gone untreated, of chronic conditions that needed management. The ship's medical staff was overwhelmed, and they gratefully accepted the Japanese nurses' assistance. Working in the ship's makeshift infirmary helped pass the time and gave Keiko a sense of purpose during the long days at sea. She fell back into the familiar rhythms of nursing, assessing patients, providing treatment, offering comfort. The other prisoners treated the nurses with respect and gratitude, and several times Keiko overheard people talking about how lucky they were to have such skilled medical personnel among them. On December 23rd, land was spotted on the horizon, Japan, home. The prisoners crowded onto the deck, straining to see the approaching coastline, their faces showing a mixture of joy and apprehension. What would they find? How much had been destroyed? Would their families be waiting? As the ship entered Yokohama harbor, the scale of destruction became visible. The city had been devastated by bombing, with vast areas reduced to rubble and ash. Buildings that had stood for decades were gone, replaced by empty lots and temporary shelters. The harbor itself showed signs of damage, with sunken ships visible in the shallow water and piers that were barely functional. It was a sobering sight, a stark reminder of how completely Japan had been defeated. The disembarkation process was slow and bureaucratic. The prisoners were processed through American occupation checkpoints, their documents checked, their names recorded, their health briefly assessed. Keiko and the other nurses were questioned about their medical training and were strongly encouraged to register with the occupation authorities as available medical personnel. Japan desperately needed nurses, they were told. Hospitals were overwhelmed, disease was rampant, medical care was one of the occupation's top priorities. Fumiko agreed immediately to register, and the other nurses followed her lead. They were given temporary identification papers, told where they could report for work assignments, and then finally released to go find their families. The group of nurses who had spent months together stood on the damaged pier, suddenly uncertain how to say goodbye. "We'll keep in touch," Fumiko said firmly. "We'll find each other again once we're settled. We've been through too much together to simply part ways now." They exchanged what information they had about where their families had lived, knowing that much of it might be outdated or irrelevant if those places no longer existed. Then, with tears and tight embraces, they separated, each heading in different directions to begin the search for their families and their futures. Keiko made her way through the ruined city, asking directions from American soldiers and local civilians, slowly navigating toward the neighborhood where her family had lived. Many streets were impassable, blocked by rubble or simply no longer existing. She passed makeshift shelters where families were living in shacks made from salvaged materials. She saw children in ragged clothes, their faces thin from malnutrition. She saw American soldiers distributing food rations to long lines of desperate people. The house where she'd grown up no longer stood. The entire block had been destroyed in a firebombing raid, leaving only foundations and scorched earth. Keiko stood staring at the empty lot, trying to reconcile her memories of home with this devastation. Where was her family? Had they survived? How would she find them? A neighbor, an old woman Keiko vaguely remembered from her childhood, approached cautiously. "Keiko-san," she asked uncertainly, "is that you? We thought you were dead." "Mrs. Sato," Keiko replied, recognizing the woman. "I've been a prisoner on Saipan. I just returned. Do you know what happened to my family?" "Where they are?" Mrs. Sato's face showed relief mixed with sorrow. "Your parents are alive," she said. "They're living in a shelter near the old school building, about a kilometer from here. Your sister is with them. But Keiko-san, I'm sorry to tell you, your brothers, both of them were killed in the fighting. Your mother hasn't been the same since she received the news." Keiko felt her legs weaken, grief washing over her. Her brothers, both dead. She'd known it was possible, likely even, but having it confirmed was devastating. They had been 19 and 17 when she last saw them, full of life and uncertain bravado as they prepared to serve their country. Now they were gone, their lives cut short for a war that had ended in defeat and destruction. "Thank you for telling me," Keiko managed to say. "Can you show me where the shelter is?" Mrs. Sato guided her through the ruined streets to a large building that had been converted into communal housing for displaced families. The conditions were crowded and basic, but it was shelter at least, protection from the winter cold. Mrs. Sato pointed to a corner of the main room where several families had staked out small areas with hanging sheets for privacy. "Your parents are there," she said softly. "Go to them, child. They need you." Keiko approached slowly, her heart pounding. She pulled aside the sheet that served as a door and saw her mother sitting on a thin futon, sewing something by the dim light filtering through a nearby window. Her father sat beside her, looking older and frailer than Keiko remembered. Her sister Michiko looked up from the book she was reading and gasped. "Mother, father," Michiko said urgently, "look, it's Keiko. She's alive. She's come home." Her mother's head snapped up, the sewing falling from her hands. For a moment she just stared, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. Then she let out a cry and rushed forward, pulling Keiko into a fierce embrace. Her father followed, wrapping his arms around both of them, and Michiko joined in, the four of them holding each other and crying, mourning the lost sons and brothers even as they celebrated this unexpected reunion. "We thought you were dead," her mother sobbed. "We heard that Saipan had fallen, that all the Japanese there had been killed. We mourned you, but you're here. You're alive. You're home." "I was captured," Keiko explained when they finally released each other enough to speak. "I was a prisoner for months. They let me work as a nurse. I helped treat wounded civilians. The Americans, they weren't what we were told they would be. They treated us fairly." Her father looked at her searchingly, as if trying to understand. "The world has changed," he said quietly. "Everything we believed, everything we were told, much of it was lies. We're learning that now, all of us. Japan must start over, must build something new from the ruins. Your brothers died for those lies, Keiko. They died believing they were protecting the Emperor's divine will. There was no divine will, only ambition and hubris and terrible decisions by men who sent millions to die for their pride." The bitterness in his voice was shocking. Her father had always been a loyal citizen, a man who trusted authority and did his duty without question. To hear him speak this way showed how profoundly the defeat had shattered the old certainties. "I'm going to work as a nurse," Keiko said. "I registered with the occupation authorities. They say hospitals are desperate for medical staff. I can help. I can make a difference. We have to build something from all this destruction. We have to find meaning in the survival." Her mother nodded, wiping her tears. "Yes," she agreed. "We survive, we work, we rebuild. That's all we can do. I'm just grateful to have you home, to have one more daughter returned to me. That's more than many mothers can say." Over the following weeks, Keiko began working at a hospital run by the occupation forces in cooperation with remaining Japanese medical staff. The conditions were challenging, with shortages of everything from bandages to antibiotics, but she threw herself into the work with desperate intensity. Helping others gave her purpose, helped her process her grief for her brothers, helped her make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. She reconnected with Fumiko and the other nurses, all of whom had found similar work at various medical facilities around the Tokyo-Yokohama area. They met when they could, sharing stories of adjustment and challenge, supporting each other as they navigated this new reality. The bond they'd formed on Saipan remained strong, a connection forged in fire that couldn't be broken by distance or circumstance. One day in early spring, Keiko was working in the hospital when an American medical officer approached her. To her amazement, it was Captain Morrison from Saipan. He recognized her immediately and smiled broadly. "Nurse Arai," he said warmly, "I'd hoped I might find you. I'm glad to see you made it home safely." "Captain Morrison," Keiko replied in much improved English, bowing respectfully. "I didn't expect to see you again." "What brings you to this hospital?" "I'm part of the Occupation Medical Corps," he explained. "We're working to rebuild Japan's healthcare system. When I saw your name on the staff roster, I wanted to check in, see how you were doing. I also wanted to tell you that I've recommended you for a position in our training program." We're establishing a new nursing school to train Japanese nurses in modern medical techniques. Your experience and skills make you an ideal candidate to be an instructor." Keiko was stunned. An instructor, teaching others. It was an opportunity she'd never imagined, a chance to pass on what she'd learned, to help create a new generation of nurses for a new Japan. "I would be honored," she said carefully. "But Captain, why me? There are many experienced nurses in Japan." "Because you've worked with both Japanese and American medical teams," Morrison replied simply. "You understand both approaches, both philosophies. You've proven you can adapt, can learn, can work collaboratively across cultural boundaries. Those are exactly the skills we need to build something new here. Japan's healthcare system was destroyed by the war. We have a chance to rebuild it better, to incorporate the best of both traditions. I can't think of anyone better suited to help with that work than you and your colleagues from Saipan." Over the next months, Keiko and 3 of the other nurses from her original group, Fumiko, Yumi, and Haruka, became founding instructors at the new nursing school. They taught Japanese students modern medical techniques while also preserving valuable traditional approaches. They emphasized the philosophy Captain Morrison had articulated on Saipan, that medicine should transcend politics and nationalism, that healing was a universal human calling that recognized no borders or enemies. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling. Keiko watched her students grow and develop, saw them graduate and go on to work in hospitals across Japan, contributing to the country's recovery. She helped write curriculum, developed new training methods, and gradually became recognized as an authority on nursing education. The scared young woman who had emerged from that cave on Saipan, certain she faced death, had been transformed into a confident professional helping to shape her country's future. Years passed. Japan slowly recovered from the devastation of war, building a new society from the ashes of the old. The occupation ended, Japanese sovereignty was restored, and the country began its remarkable transformation into an economic power. Through it all, Keiko continued her work, training generation after generation of nurses, always emphasizing compassion, skill, and the fundamental humanity that transcended all other divisions. She married in 1952 a kind doctor named Hiroshi, who had also served during the war and who understood the complexities of healing in the aftermath of trauma. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, and Keiko told them stories of their uncles they'd never met, keeping the memory of her lost brothers alive while also teaching them about the futility of war and the importance of peace. She stayed in touch with the other nurses from Saipan. Fumiko eventually became the director of a major hospital in Osaka. Yumi married an American soldier and moved to California, sending letters describing her life in a foreign land and her work at a hospital there. Haruka opened a small clinic in a rural area, bringing modern medical care to communities that had been underserved. Reiko and Ayako both continued working as hospital nurses, finding satisfaction in direct patient care rather than administration or teaching. They reunited every few years, gathering to remember their experiences and honor the memories of those who hadn't survived. At these gatherings, they would inevitably talk about that moment when they emerged from the cave, expecting the worst, and instead finding the opportunity to continue their calling. It was a turning point for all of them, the moment when their understanding of the world fundamentally shifted, when they learned that enemies could show kindness and that healing transcended nationality. Keiko kept Henderson's photograph in a small frame on her desk at the nursing school. She also kept the reference letter Captain Morrison had written, now yellowed with age but still legible. Sometimes students would ask about these items, and she would tell them the story of Saipan, of being captured and terrified and then being handed bandages and asked to help. She would tell them about working alongside former enemies, about learning that people were people regardless of what flag they saluted, about the power of seeing past propaganda to recognize shared humanity. "That's the most important lesson I can teach you," she would tell her students. "Medicine doesn't belong to any one country or people. Healing is a universal human impulse, the desire to ease suffering and preserve life. When you become nurses, you'll take an oath to care for all patients, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That oath matters more than politics, more than national pride, more than any ideology. Remember that, and you'll be good nurses. Forget it, and all your technical skill will mean nothing. In 1965, Keiko received a letter from Henderson's sister in California. Henderson had given her Keiko's name before he died of cancer, asking his sister to write and let Keiko know that he'd thought of her often over the years, that working alongside her on Saipan had reinforced his faith in humanity's capacity for goodness even in the worst circumstances. His sister included a photograph of Henderson with his wife and children, a family man who had lived a full life before illness claimed him too early. Keiko wept when she read the letter, mourning this man she'd barely known but who had represented so much to her. He had been one of the first Americans to treat her with respect and kindness, to see her as a colleague rather than an enemy. His simple gesture of sharing his sister's photograph, of trying to connect across the divide of war, had meant more to her than he probably ever realized. She wrote back to his sister, expressing her condolences and sharing her own memories of Henderson, grateful for the chance to honor his memory. As Keiko grew older, she became something of a spokesperson for reconciliation and peace. She gave lectures about her experiences, wrote articles for medical journals about the importance of maintaining medical ethics, even during war, and worked with international organizations promoting cooperation in healthcare. She met with American veterans groups, sharing her perspective as someone who had been on the other side and emphasizing the lessons she'd learned about our common humanity. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, Keiko was invited to return to Saipan for a memorial ceremony. She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to revisit the place that held so many painful memories. But ultimately, she decided to go, bringing her husband and her oldest daughter with her for support. The island had been transformed over the decades. Where there had been war-torn landscape, there was now development and tourism. But the memorials remained, somber reminders of the terrible price paid by so many. Keiko visited the cave where she and the others had hidden, now preserved as a historical site. She stood at the entrance, remembering the darkness and fear, the certainty that death was coming, the sound of American voices calling out in broken Japanese. She walked to the area where the medical camp had been set up, though nothing remained of it now except grass and trees. She tried to picture it as it had been, the rows of wounded civilians, the American medics working alongside captured Japanese nurses, the moment when Captain Morrison had placed medical supplies in her hands and asked for her help. It had been right here, on this spot, that her understanding of the world had begun to change, that she'd realized enemies could be healers too. At the memorial ceremony, representatives from multiple countries spoke about the importance of remembering history while working toward peaceful cooperation. Japanese officials stood alongside American dignitaries, former enemies now allies. Chamorro representatives from the island's native population spoke about their suffering during the war and their hopes for a future where such conflicts would never recur. When it was Keiko's turn to speak, she told her story simply and honestly. She described the fear of capture, the surprise of being asked to help, the gradual realization that much of what she'd been told was propaganda and lies. She talked about working alongside American medics, about caring for wounded civilians, about finding purpose and humanity in the midst of war's chaos. "I was taught to see Americans as monsters," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I was taught that capture would mean torture and death, that the enemy was inhuman and cruel. Every bit of that teaching was wrong. The Americans who captured me treated me with respect and allowed me to continue my calling as a nurse. They gave me supplies and asked me to help heal the wounded. In doing so, they gave me something more valuable than my physical freedom. They gave me the truth, and the truth set me free from the lies I'd believed." She paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing Japanese and American faces, seeing Chamorro Islanders and tourists from dozens of countries. "We cannot change the past," she continued. "We cannot bring back those who died or undo the suffering that was inflicted. But we can choose to learn from history rather than repeat it. We can choose to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. We can choose healing over harm, cooperation over conflict. Truth over propaganda. That's the legacy we owe to all those who died here. The commitment to build a world where such wars become impossible because we recognize our common humanity. The audience applauded, and afterward many people approached her to share their own stories, their own journeys from war to peace, their own moments of recognition across the enemy divide. An elderly American veteran, tears streaming down his face, told her he'd been one of the soldiers at the cave that day, one of those calling for the Japanese to surrender peacefully. "I'm so glad we saved you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so glad you survived to do all this good work that makes the war, all the horror of it, if not worthwhile, then at least meaningful. You turned that moment into a lifetime of healing. Thank you." Keiko embraced him, this stranger who had been there at the most terrifying moment of her life, who had been part of the force that captured her, and in capturing her, had somehow saved her. "Thank you for your kindness that day," she replied. "Thank you for seeing prisoners as people who deserved mercy. You gave me my future. I've tried to honor that gift." After returning from Saipan, Keiko continued her work with renewed purpose. She established an exchange program that brought American nursing students to Japan and sent Japanese students to America, fostering cross-cultural understanding in the medical field. She published a memoir about her experiences, which became required reading in many nursing schools across Asia. She consulted with international humanitarian organizations on protocols for treating prisoners of war and maintaining medical ethics during conflicts. As she moved into her 70s and eventually her 80s, Keiko gradually reduced her active work but never fully retired. She continued to lecture occasionally, to mentor young nurses, to advocate for peace and reconciliation. Her children and grandchildren were proud of her accomplishments and carried forward her values in their own lives and careers. In 2005, at age 85, Keiko was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese government for her contributions to nursing education and international cooperation. At the ceremony, she wore the medal alongside a smaller pin that few recognized, a Red Cross emblem from her days as a young nurse on Saipan. Both symbols represented who she was, the frightened young woman who had once believed lies, and the wise elder who had learned to see truth. In her acceptance speech, she returned to the themes that had defined her life's work. "I was given a second chance when I deserved no special consideration," she said to the assembled dignitaries. "I was treated with humanity when I expected cruelty. That gift changed everything for me, showed me that even in war's darkest moments, people can choose kindness over cruelty, healing over harm. I've spent my life trying to pass that lesson forward, trying to create a world where such choices become natural rather than exceptional. I hope I've succeeded in some small measure. I hope the nurses I've trained will carry forward that vision, will treat every patient as a human being worthy of care and respect, regardless of any other consideration." Keiko Arai lived to be 93 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in 2013. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former students and colleagues, fellow nurses from her Saipan days, representatives from medical organizations and government agencies. American veterans made the journey to honor her, as did Chamorro representatives from Saipan. It was a gathering that reflected the breadth of her impact and the depth of respect she had earned. Her oldest daughter gave the eulogy, speaking about a mother who had turned trauma into purpose, who had transformed fear into understanding, who had spent 7 decades proving that healing could transcend any human division. "My mother's story," she concluded, "is not just about surviving war or even about reconciliation, though it's about both of those things. It's fundamentally about the choice to see humanity in others. We've been taught to see enemies. It's about the courage to question propaganda and seek truth. It's about the power of healing to bridge divides that seem impossible to cross." She lived those values every day, and in doing so, she changed countless lives for the better. That's a legacy worth celebrating and emulating. In the years since her death, Keiko's story has been told and retold in books and articles, in documentary films and academic papers, in nursing schools and peace studies programs. The nursing school she helped found has educated tens of thousands of nurses, many of whom have gone on to work internationally. carrying forward her vision of medicine that transcends borders. The exchange programs she established continue to bring students from different countries together, fostering understanding and cooperation in the next generation of healthcare professionals. A scholarship fund was established in her name, providing support for nursing students who demonstrate both clinical excellence and a commitment to humanitarian values. Recipients of the Keiko Arai Memorial Scholarship are required to complete a project focused on cross-cultural understanding in healthcare, ensuring that her emphasis on seeing past divisions continues to shape new professionals. On Saipan, a plaque was installed at the cave, where she and the other nurses emerged into American custody. It bears her name alongside those of her fellow nurses and includes her words about the transformative power of being treated with humanity when expecting cruelty. The site has become a stop for school groups and tourists, a place to reflect on both the horrors of war and the possibilities of reconciliation. The photograph Henderson gave her, the reference letter from Captain Morrison, and other artifacts from her time on Saipan are now housed in a medical museum in Tokyo, displayed as part of an exhibit on wartime nursing and post-war recovery. Visitors to the exhibit can read her story, see the documents and images that mark turning points in her life, and reflect on the lessons she learned and taught, perhaps most importantly, the philosophy she championed, that healing transcends politics and nationality, that medical personnel have a duty to care for all who need help regardless of circumstances, has become embedded in nursing education across Japan and beyond. Her students, and their students in turn, carry forward her conviction that the first question should always be, "How can I help?" rather than, "Who are you?" or "Which side are you on?" The cave on Saipan, where Keiko's transformation began, remains a powerful symbol. Every year, groups of nursing students from Japan and America visit together, learning about the history while reflecting on their shared calling. They stand at that entrance where Keiko once stood trembling, where she expected death but found purpose, where enemies became colleagues in the work of healing. They read her words carved into the memorial plaque, words about the moment when bandages were placed in her hands, and she realized her skills still mattered, that her humanity was recognized even in captivity. Her story reminds each new generation that in our darkest moments, when fear and propaganda threaten to dehumanize the other, we have a choice. We can choose to see enemies, or we can choose to see fellow human beings. We can choose cruelty, or we can choose compassion. We can choose to perpetuate cycles of hatred, or we can choose to break them through simple acts of recognition and respect. Keiko Arai made that choice in the chaos of war's end, when American medics handed her supplies and asked for help, instead of treating her as the monster propaganda had painted. She spent the rest of her long life honoring that choice, teaching others to make it, proving through decades of service that healing could indeed transcend every human division. In a world that often seems determined to categorize people as us versus them, friend versus enemy, her legacy stands as a testament to the power of our shared humanity and the revolutionary act of choosing to see it, even and especially when circumstances suggest we should not. The frightened young nurse who emerged from darkness into light that day in July 1945 could never have imagined the impact her life would have. But impact it did, rippling outward through students and patients and colleagues, through stories told and lessons taught, through the simple insistence that care and compassion must always come first. That is how wars truly end, not with surrender documents and treaties, but with individuals choosing to heal rather than harm, to understand rather than hate, to build bridges instead of walls. And so, Keiko Arai's story lives on, a reminder of what becomes possible when we dare to question the lies we've been told, when we have the courage to extend humanity even to those designated as enemies, and when we commit ourselves to healing a broken world, one patient, one student, one act of compassion at a time.